When I fly around on Google Earth, I always end up in New York. In my opinion, it's one of the most fascinating places on Earth, but almost every time before, I was simply too focused on all the infrastructure like crazy subway junctions, highway interchanges or these double-deck bridges. But then I thought, wait a moment, all these millions of people using the infrastructure daily have to live somewhere, right? And suddenly I realized the places where New Yorkers actually live can look just as wild as the infrastructure itself when they don't fall apart. Have you ever seen massive towers sitting right on top of highways? That's a pretty wild concept, not gonna lie. But to be fair, we even have that in Germany, so that's fine I guess. Then we have some of the strangest brutalist architecture I've ever seen, and whole clusters of buildings that are basically a city within the city. As we can see, New York is full of housing experiments that you'd never expect to find in the middle of Manhattan, or the Bronx, or anywhere else. Yet thousands of people call them home. I'm Daniel, and today we explore some of the most fascinating apartment complexes in New York City and see how they ended up looking the way they do and whether they actually worked as intended or were doomed to fail right from the start. In Upper Manhattan, right where the George Washington Bridge lands, you'll see one of the strangest housing experiments in the city. 4 tall towers rise directly above the Trans-Manhattan Expressway, 12 lanes of I-95 funneling east and west under their foundations. These are the Bridge Apartments, built in the early 1960s. They were one of the first big air rights projects in New York, where the city basically sold the space above a highway to developers. The city desperately needed more housing, so why not use the land that seemed otherwise wasted? Back then, the result was futuristic on paper. Highways and housing stacked neatly on top of each other. In reality, it meant thousands of people living just a few meters above non-stop traffic. Families are cooking dinner, kids are doing homework, while underneath them, trucks and buses roar through one of the busiest interstates on the East Coast. And right next door sits the George Washington Bridge bus station. This one also reminds me a bit of the Port Authority bus terminal we covered earlier, with all the ramps feeding directly into it. Simply fascinating stuff. Anyway, the views must be amazing from the higher floors, but what's the trade-off? Constant noise, vibrations and pollution, I suppose. The Bridge Apartments still remain one of the most storied and most controversial housing experiments New York ever tried. In the Bronx stand 2 of the most fascinating apartments in NYC, the Tracy Towers. Designed by architect Paul Rudolph and completed in the early 1970s under the Mitchell-Lama housing program, the towers rise about 40 stories each and contain more than 800 apartments. Their design makes them instantly recognizable. Instead of flat facades, the buildings are made up of a series of cylindrical forms grouped together. The textured concrete and narrow vertical windows gave them a distinctive brutalist appearance. Somehow, I find that architectural style extremely fascinating, but also kinda daunting. What do you think about brutalism? There are also these sweeping ramps running into the base of the towers. These are access roads to garages and service areas built into the podium. Right next to the complex sits a large parking lot, which was included from the start as part of the development. In the car-focused planning era of the 1970s, large parking provisions were considered just as important as the housing itself, even though the towers sit right next to a subway station. The combination of these fortress-like towers, elevated platforms and integrated ramps gives the Tracy Towers a very iconic look on the Bronx skyline. For residents, the buildings provide wide views across the borough and into Manhattan, while for the city they remain one of the boldest housing experiments of their time. right on the Harlem River. In the Bronx stand 4 or 2, I don't really know to be honest. But yeah, these massive towers that once held the title of the tallest buildings in the borough, the River Park Towers. Completed in the mid-1970s and designed by Davis, Brody and Associates, the River Park Towers are definitely hard to miss. 2 of the towers rise 44 stories or 130 meters tall, and the others are slightly shorter at 112 meters, making them among the tallest residential buildings in the Bronx at the time. In total, the complex has about 5,000 tenants. Clad in a distinctive reddish super brick, the towers were also part of the Mitchell-Lama program, intended to provide affordable housing while also taking advantage of the site's location along the Harlem River. From above, the 4 towers dominate the valley between the river and the major Deegan Expressway, as well as the Metro North rail lines. The development also included landscape plazas and open space at its base, but the surrounding infrastructure, highways, bridges and rail lines means the site still feels somewhat cut off from the rest of the neighborhood. Over the years, residents have raised concerns about maintenance and management, and some even call it the most dangerous hood in the Bronx. On Manhattan's East River, just south of 30th Street, you'll find Waterside Plaza, a complex that almost looks like it was glued to the side of the island after the rest of the city was finished. Built between 1973 and 1974, it consists of 4 red brick towers plus a row of townhouses. From above, it stands out immediately because it's the only large residential complex built on the water side of the FDR Drive. Everything else in this part of Manhattan stops at the highway, but here the city pushed a tiny bit further out. The entire development sits on landfill and concrete decking that extends over the East River, essentially creating a new land for thousands of residents. Waterside Plaza was originally developed under the Mitchell-Lama housing program. I think slowly but surely we can recognize a pattern here. The site intended to provide middle-income families with affordable apartments. For years it kept that status, but by the early 2000s the project left the program and most of the units converted to market rate rentals. Some affordability protections remain in place though. The design itself was ambitious for its time. The towers use a pinwheel layout to maximize river views, while the elevated podium contains plazas, shops and community facilities. The idea was to build a self-contained neighborhood hovering above the river and the highway below. The red brick cladding tied it back to New York's traditional housing stock, but the overall concept, a whole community on an artificial platform, was something entirely new. Nearly 50 years later, Waterside Plaza still feels slightly detached from the rest of Manhattan, both physically and socially, but that separation is exactly what makes it so distinctive. It's one of the city's most recognizable experiments in combining waterfront development, affordable housing and modernist urban design. Uptown in East Harlem stands another giant housing project, 1199 Plaza, later renamed East River Landing. It was developed in the early 1970s by the Healthcare Workers Union Local 1199 and built under the, you have 3 guesses?
Wow, I didn't know that.
Mitchell-Lama housing program. The complex consists of 4 tall towers, each about 31 stories, linked to mid-rise wings that terrace down toward the river and form plazas in between. With about 1,600 apartments, it's one of the largest single residential projects on Manhattan's east side. I think the city planner used the move it copy and paste feature here. as the towers look basically identical. The whole development was intended as a city within a city, complete with open spaces, parking and community services built directly into the layout. Over time, like many similar projects, it's faced challenges with maintenance and management issues, but it's still one of the coolest looking housing projects on the east side of Manhattan. So looking back at all of these examples, towers above highways, brutalist experiments in the Bronx, mega structures on the Harlem River and whole communities built out into the East River, it becomes clear that New York's housing is every bit as ambitious and unusual as its subway system or road network. Some of these complexes worked as intended, others struggled, and a few were probably doomed to fail right from the beginning. But together they brought somewhat affordable housing to thousands of people in one of the most expensive and densest cities on the planet, and contribute to the mix that makes New York architecturally so incredibly fascinating. Thanks for watching.